For over 50 years, the information we've been given about the Beatles has been at best revisionist and at worst complete lies. This book goes into detail about why Beatle myths have masqueraded as fact for the last 50 years, and also talks about a whole slew of new writers that are challenging the old narratives. We're going to talk about this book here on Pop Goes the 60s. I'm sure many of you have read books about the Beatles where you know that they contain factual errors or abject bias. Well, the fact of the matter is that most Beatles history, as told by biographers and journalists, don't actually qualify as history. And this book beautifully outlines that. It's called The Beatles and the Historians, an analysis of writings about the Fab Four by Erin Torkelson Weber. Now, this book discusses at length the four narratives that have emerged in Beatles history. And those four are the Fab Four narrative, the Lennon Remembers narrative, the Shout narrative, and the Lewison narrative. Okay, now I want you to bear with me here because I know this may sound a little bit dry at the outset, but as I describe these four narratives, it'll make a lot more sense to you. This book really helped me to understand Beatles history. I mean, it didn't take very long for her to describe it either. This is a quick read, and I'll get into the book a little bit in a moment, but the narratives that have existed have emerged over time and told by different people and are fraught with bias and agenda. And really, Torkelson Weber uses scientific method to record history, and oftentimes it takes about 50 years time to pass before history starts being recorded accurately. So she uses scientific methods and a lot of writers to back up how that method emerged and the methods that are used for this. And she applies this to the writers who have written biography about the Beatles. Let me start with the first and just explain the first narrative, which is called the Fab Four narrative. This narrative is the time that the Beatles came to fame, roughly late 1962 to their demise in 1970. And this narrative was what's called somewhat of a whitewashed narrative that they told themselves. The Beatles were the only ones telling their own story, with the exception of Hunter Davies' book, his biography in '68. But this part of the narrative was a typical Hollywood treatment, which you would expect, where you didn't hear about promiscuity on the road, you didn't hear about drugs, you didn't hear about their manager Brian Epstein's homosexuality, the fact that their marriages were suppressed to the fans to make them look more available. You had these hard days night stereotypes put on them by the press to kind of identify with them, but essentially that just gave a very cartoon-esque view of each Beatle. So the Fab Four narrative, though sanitized, there was always glimpses into the Beatles that were not so Hollywood looking. For instance, the book Love Me Do by Michael Braun, he spent some time with them on the road, and that was much less censored. It talked about their drinking alcohol, they were using cuss words, they didn't care much about their image in America, and it showed some of the rougher personalities. So that's considered to be much more authentic. Maureen Cleave did a series of interviews in 1966, the big one being the John Lennon "We're Bigger Than Jesus" thing that created an uproar. Also in those same interviews, McCartney talked about segregation and Harrison about being anti-Vietnam War. So these are typical things that were not topics that would enhance their image. So these started to creep out a little bit as they began to grow and mature. So the next narrative is the Lennon Remembers narrative, and this existed really the whole decade of the 70s until John Lennon's murder. And just 3 weeks after the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles was announced, the Jan Wenner article appeared in January of 1971 in the Rolling Stone magazine, which essentially John Lennon set out to absolutely destroy the Beatles myth. And he rejected much of the Beatles catalog. He dismissed his own Beatles songs as being dishonest. He attacked virtually everyone he worked with while with the Beatles, including Neil Aspinall, George Martin, and Derek Taylor. And he blamed the Beatles, quote, "the Beatles and their pals' treatment of Yoko Ono as a reason for him taking heroin." Also during this time was the Paul McCartney press release with his new album, McCartney, that talked about him taking a break from the Beatles. And that acted as, the world saw that as the Beatles breakup announcement. And that came out at this time as well, which fueled the Lennon Remembers interview with Rolling Stone. The Lennon Remembers interview is considered very questionable for a lot of reasons. including its sole reliance on John Lennon's eyewitness testimony. So in the historian's craft, he cautions against blindly accepting testimony from any source, however memorable. This whole Lennon Remembers was relatively unchallenged until Peter Doggett's book, You Never Give Me Your Money, and Mark Herksted's book, A Day in the Life. And for many years, it was just accepted as fact, what Lennon said. And they pointed to his honesty and his bearing his soul as some factual proof, which is not historically accurate. You can't use that as just mere proof. So some of the things here, according to the historical methods, there are three major factors that call into question the Lennon Remembers narrative as a truthful and definitive account. And number one, it was intended for public consumption. It was a public interview that was intended to sell and not to provide the truth. So it was also to promote his album and his partnership with Yoko Ono, as well as advocate for Alan Klein. The second one is Lennon's state of mind. So there's evidence that he was using heroin at this time and possibly cocaine, and it may have affected his testimony. So even if he was sober, heroin was an issue in the last 2 years of the Beatle years, which Lennon admitted at that time because he was using heroin. And then thirdly, Lennon disavowed this interview years later and multiple times, particularly in the Playboy interview in 1980, where Lennon admitted lying regarding his partnership with McCartney. Harrison also admonished the Wenner interview for refusing to acknowledge that Lennon now disagreed with what he said. So one of the things to take into account here with regard to the Lennon Remembers narrative is his alliance with Jan Wenner and Rolling Stone, and Rolling Stone's using of John Lennon to help launch essentially a newer magazine. The magazine had been on for a few years, but as it continued to position itself with left-wing politics, it used the Lennon interview as the de facto explanation for why the Beatles broke up. This is the only thing that was really out there. And Wenner made excellent use of that. And what he did, he went so much farther than that, though. Here's what Wenner did. I did not know that until I read this book. But one of the reviewers that was reviewing Paul McCartney's first solo album gave him a positive review, and Wenner made them change it to a negative review. That's how diabolical this stuff gets. During the same time, Paul McCartney was granting very few interviews during that whole decade, and Ringo Starr was not asked much either, and George Harrison kept a low profile as well. Now, the next narrative, which is called the Shout narrative, has to do with Philip Norman's book Shout. And this book is flawed for three reasons, according to Torkelson Weber here. Number one, improper historical distance, lack of documentation, and deliberate bias. He wrote it as a novelist rather than a historian. And if anybody's read this book, this book hammers McCartney like you wouldn't believe. So it essentially takes the Lennon Remembers narrative and enhances it. Now Philip Norman had the fortuitous timing of having this be published just after the death of John Lennon. And he had been working on it for a couple years. So he took the Lennon Remembers narrative and greatly enhanced it and really used it to step on McCartney's throat and really at every opportunity say something negative about McCartney. So not only does he disparage Paul McCartney, but he has nothing good to say about George Harrison and completely marginalizes Ringo Starr. And he calls John Lennon 3/4 of the Beatles. All right, let me just give you a couple examples here. So all four Beatles refused to be interviewed for this work. And Norman had a problem with that. He even discussed that in his prologue. So he took a little issue with the four Beatles not wanting to be interviewed for this, which if you're documenting history, you can't let that stuff bother you. He calls McCartney words like petulant, prima donna, and demanded to be worshipped, while calling George an annoying tag-along, a mediocre musician with an absurd obsession with Hare Krishna. All of this while essentially ignoring Ringo Starr and omitting any failings of Lennon and Ono. Ono's introduction of heroin to Lennon is not even mentioned. So you can see the bias is just incredibly lopsided in this book. So other books that came out during this time was Peter Brown's The Love You Make, and Peter Brown was a Beatle insider. That book was a little bit sensationalism. The Beatles all discounted that book. So another book was Ray Coleman, Lennon, The Definitive Biography, which also venerates John Lennon. But then we've got something a little bit opposite, which is Albert Goldman's The Lives of John Lennon. So this book is completely negative on Lennon and goes way over in the other direction, where he takes every negative aspect about Lennon's life and talks about only that and accentuating some of that, much without documentation. Some with, but much without. So the Goldman book was kind of that's this one right here. This one was so controversial that Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone took an entire publication of the magazine to respond to this. Wenner blasted it, but adding that his friendship with Ono doesn't undermine the credibility of Rolling Stone, adding in the next sentence that his magazine would never, quote, print anything mean or nasty about John Lennon because there was nothing mean or nasty in his life. Kind of sounds like journalism today, doesn't it? So anyway, we see this strange turn of events here with the Goldman book. Another book that was out during this time was John Lennon's friend Pete Shotton's book. And that book is considered more balanced than anything that came out during this time. Okay, the fourth narrative is called the Lewisohn Narrative. And this kicked off in the late 80s, roughly with Mark Lewison's book, The Complete Beatles Recordings. And this was the first time the Beatles were really handled in such a fashion where it's just complete documentation. What's interesting is that the documentation available about the recording sessions, which are verifiable on the tapes, those go in contrast to some of the Lennon Remembers narrative as well as the Shout narrative that marginalized McCartney. McCartney also hit back. So his reputation was really dragged through the mud with the Philip Norman account and that biography. So McCartney struck back with his buddy Barry Miles writing a book for him called Many Years From Now, which essentially reestablished Paul McCartney as not just a lightweight pop writer, which he never really was just that. Many Years From Now by Barry Miles levels the playing field quite a bit by bringing up McCartney's contributions to many songs. And then he was really dabbling in this avant-garde thing long before John Lennon. Now the problem with the Barry Miles book, it made McCartney it made him look petty. At this time, we also had him talking about wanting to have the song Yesterday have the names reversed to say from Lennon McCartney to McCartney Lennon. We all know that he wrote the song, and with almost very little help from John Lennon, if at all. Do the names need to switch? It just looked petty. And the book looks revisionist, although it's probably more accurate than the Lennon Remembers. Verifying that is George Martin's book, All You Need Is Ears. He's a genuine primary source that was there and gave his accounts, and relatively unbiased. He not only said all the good McCartney did, but the good Lennon did, and that he too maybe overlooked some of George Harrison's talents as well. So George Martin gives what appears to be quite a balanced account of those recording sessions. We have another writer called Ian MacDonald. He wrote a book called Revolution in the Head that did not anoint any Beatle. And what's important about his book is he has references in the book. One of the things about both The Lives of John Lennon and Philip Norman's Shout, very low on citations. Very weak bibliography. These guys did not cite their sources. And they use quotes that aren't substantiated. Mark Hertsgaard's book, A Day in the Life, The Music and Artistry of the Beatles, is another excellent book that really talks about the Beatles from a musical, analytical standpoint, something that these other guys, Goldman and Philip Norman, these guys they weren't musicians, so they couldn't speak to the subject matter with any great authority. Also during this time, we had the Beatles anthology that came out in roughly 1995 with the 7-part video, the music that came out of all the unreleased material, and the big coffee table book that compiled tons of interviews. Now, the anthology kind of reverts to the Fab Four narrative. There are agendas in retelling some of these stories, particularly by Harrison and McCartney. But for the first time, we have a balance where all the story isn't told by just McCartney or by just Lennon. We have a pretty good balance of the three remaining Beatles, plus archival information of John Lennon that's also used. So during this fourth wave, the Lewisohn narrative, we also started to see the waning popularity of the Rolling Stone magazine. So that Lennon Remembers narrative started to wane a little bit as well. But we did still see resistance to this new Lewisian narrative. Rolling Stone, though the popularity was waning, oftentimes reverted to the Lennon Remembers narrative without making any mention that Lennon himself had disregarded some of the things he said in that. So in spite of the many new facts that came to be during the Lewisian narrative, which by the way was all documented, a lot of it coming out of EMI's own vaults, etc., and it's on tape, a lot of these writers still wouldn't accept that, and they just pushed their own agenda. And that's starting to, I don't know how that can keep going on. Those writers are just going to look more and more foolish as more and more information comes out that is documented and sourced. A couple of very good books. Peter Doggett's You Never Give Me Your Money. I've got that in here somewhere. Yeah, here. This is a book that documents the breakup of the Beatles extremely well. And it's impartial. I mean, it gives the warts and all, and there are many, but it doesn't, the moral judgments are distributed evenly. It doesn't favor one Beatle over the other. So this is really the new style of writing that really gives a balanced view and tries to give as much information as possible so everybody can maybe make their own mind up about what actually happened. We're starting to see this turn and taking the lead of Mark Lewisohn's great Tune In as the new way to try to apply historical method to get to the truth. Well, that's it for today's video, a little more academic than I normally do, I confess. But I'm really looking forward to doing more Beatle videos like this where I'm going to be applying historical method to get to the truth. So Erin Torkelson Weber's book, make sure to pick this up. It's very affordable, and I didn't go over nearly half of the stuff she's got in here. I'll leave that, some surprises in there, and she talks about she gets to the bottom of the actual author of Eleanor Rigby as well, so that's interesting. So make sure to pick that up. In the meantime, hit that subscribe button here if you want to see more of my videos, and hit the notification bell so you know when I have a new video coming up. Thanks for watching. Pop goes the 60s.